You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie in America.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you are listening to your favorite international podcast.
Hi, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving. Today is Thanksgiving. This episode will drop tomorrow. Quick reminder, we'll do Patreon thanks next week maybe, but just a quick reminder that the get-together is the 30th.
Yes, and a special shout out and thanks to our YouTube listener, SoCal Deb, who left a comment pointing out that we should create playlists to help listeners to continue listening, who just want to listen to us all day. And thank you so much. I don't know why I haven't thought about it, and it makes so much sense. Consider it done. I'll do it by the end of the month, beginning of next month.
It does. We have the best listeners, honestly. The best. And also, if you can't tell, we're doing this alone.
And if you want to know more about how to contact us or how to support us, please listen until the end, because that's when we'll tell you all about that. I'd say let's dive right in.
Yeah.
And today, Annie has a timely and local, to her, local topic for us.
That's right. If you are in the Boston area or New England, you probably already know that every year the city of Boston gets its huge, gorgeous annual Christmas tree from Nova Scotia. The reason that they send us a gorgeous tree every year is as a thank you to Boston for the city's response and aid after the horrific explosion that devastated Halifax in 1917. I know that this story has been covered a lot, so if you are thinking you already know everything about the Halifax explosion, I am hoping to touch on a few of the lesser-known aspects of this really awful, shocking event.
I know almost nothing about it. All I know is that it was the biggest man-made explosion until the atomic bomb, but that happened decades later. I think that's correct, right?
Yeah, when Robert Oppenheimer was computing the strength of the atomic bomb, he studied the Halifax explosion to sort of make some calculations. And I guess the Halifax explosion was determined to be 1/7 that of what was dropped on Japan by U.S. forces. So knowing what I've read now about what happened in Halifax and thinking 7 times worse than that I'm honestly having a hard time sort of wrapping my brain around it. This is also going to be a 2-part episode because I really want to get into specifics of what happened. And so there's just no way to tell it in one episode. So we're going to talk about it this week and next week. We've already given you some of our history of Nova Scotia when we discussed how Halifax responded to aid in the aftermath of the sinking of the Titanic. That was back in episode 60. And at the time, we did get quite a few people who messaged saying, are you going to cover the explosion? And it was yes, definitely. Needless to say that the experience Halifax had during the sinking of Titanic in mobilizing morgues, it would serve them well when this disaster would strike them directly only 5 years later. You know me, I have a ton of sources for these episodes, including articles in the Canadian Encyclopedia, specifically by Lois Kernaghan and Richard Foote, and also one by Lindsay Ruck, several articles from the CBC, the website of our old friends at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, they're amazing, articles in Legion magazine, most notably one by Sharon Adams, books, articles, and interviews given by Janice Kitts, a historian on the topic, and many, many other articles and, contemporary newspapers of the time. All of this will go in the full source list. We are going to be discussing a massive explosion as well as the aftermath, including the deaths of adults and children. So if that's something that's difficult for you, you might want to skip this one. All right. Halifax Harbor is one of the largest and deepest natural harbors in the world that doesn't also have to deal with ice. Halifax was, at one time, among the most important commercial ports in the Atlantic. Its location made it very handy for connecting North America and Europe. The Mi'kmaq are the original inhabitants of this land, and their name for Halifax is Chibuktuk. The name means Great Harbor in their language, and Wikipedia tells us this about Halifax, that the weather is usually warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer than it is inland, with temperature mostly staying between around 18 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit, which is -8 to 28 degrees Celsius. Precipitation is high year-round. Winter brings a mix of rain, freezing rain, and snow, with frequent freeze-thaw cycles. Snowfall is heavy in winter, but snow cover is usually patchy owing to the frequent freeze-thaw cycles, which melt accumulated snow. Some winters feature cold temperatures and fewer freeze-thaw cycles, the most recent of which being the winter of 2014-2015, which was the coldest, snowiest, and stormiest in about a century. That was a hell of a winter. That was the winter where we had to get the National Guard in down here to move snow. And speaking of a century ago, do you like how I just slid that right in? When World War I broke out, Canada also declared war in support of Great Britain because it was a British territory at the time. 30,000 soldiers from Nova Scotia's population of around 550,000 would serve in the war, and among them was the No. 2 Construction Battalion. This was Canada's first and only segregated military unit, and half of the 600 men who made up this battalion were from Nova Scotia. The other 300 had come from other parts of Canada, the United States, and even the Caribbean islands. Nova Scotia had a pretty decent black population at this time. The Underground Railroad had terminated in Nova Scotia and other parts of Canada, and Africville was the neighborhood where most Black people in Halifax area lived. Africville has its own fascinating, devastating story for another time. So the Canadian government, when war broke out, allowed formation of this unit in 1916 after the usual branches of the military, they just didn't want to serve. They didn't want Black men on any of their units. And it's important to remember that being opposed to slavery did not also mean that one felt everyone was equal. I used to think that. I sincerely used to think that Canada, the northern US, was this very enlightened place, which is no racism. And obviously, that's not the case at all. Not at all. Clement Courtney Liguore was one of the men who sought to join the war effort. He had arrived in the United States from the Caribbean island of Trinidad in 1904 at the age of 19. He then relocated to Ontario, where he attended Queen's University. He graduated with a Bachelor of Medicine in 1914 and a Doctor of Medicine in 1916. And he was lucky to get his degree because 2 years later, the university banned Black students from their medical program. This was apparently an attempt to impress the AMA, the American Medical Association, and get a better rating. So that sucks. But fortunately, he got his education before that happened. You just feel like, why do people keep going backwards, right? It's like, come on. He planned to return to the United States and seek citizenship there. But when the war broke out, Dr. Liguore decided not to seek citizenship in the United States, but rather to stay and enlist, hopefully as a medical officer in the new No. 2 Construction Battalion. He traveled to Halifax, hoping for this position, but he was told that he failed the physical by 1 point. Lindsay Ruck writes in an article for the Canadian Encyclopedia, quote, "While this was the explanation given, there was speculation that the real reason Liguore was denied the role was that a Black man at that time could never be given the rank of captain. The job instead went to Captain Dan Murray, grandfather of Nova Scotia's singing great, Anne Murray," end quote. So I thought that was so interesting. Not casting any shade on Anne Murray's grandfather or anything. It's just interesting. And it explains why the job of chief medical officer to a segregated unit went to a white doctor. So he stayed and he helped, Ligure stayed and helped instead to recruit more troops for the battalion. And he also raised money for the unit. And we're going to talk about him more later on. So just remember Clement Ligure. As for the No. 2 Construction Battalion, when they were supposed to leave for the front, they then had to wait. So they were all ready to go. And when it was time to load the ship and get into this sort of battle formation, they were told to stay behind because there were too many protests from the men on the ship that they were supposed to depart on who didn't want to travel with black men. Then, once they got to the front, they weren't allowed to have weapons. That was a little too scary, too much worry about teaching these particular men how to handle firearms or explosives and concerns about what might happen when they return to the colonies. So that's some bullshit. And instead, they were assigned the grueling task of building roads and digging trenches for the white soldiers. But make no mistake, this was really crucial, if less glamorous, part of the Allied effort, and probably helped you sleep better at night than what some other people had to do. Once they returned home from the war, they often found that they, along with their Native Canadian and First Nation veterans of war, did not get the same respect and, crucially, the promised veterans benefits as the white veterans. So I'll link more to them in our sources, but I'd never heard of the No. 2 Construction Battalion before, and I thought that was fascinating. So during the war, Halifax was a major port, and supplies were sent from the U.S. and Canada to Europe, and hospital ships were coming back from the front, returning wounded back home. Halifax was the first port that you reach when you're coming from Europe. And so the popularity and importance of the port grew. To explain more about the city's layout, this is an article in the Canadian Encyclopedia by Lois Kernahan and Richard Foote, who write, quote, "All this activity boosted the economy, made jobs plentiful, and gave this small city a buzz its residents hadn't experienced in decades. Civilian migrants arrived in search of available work at the dockyards, rail yards, the sugar refinery, and other factories. Women also took up paid jobs once filled by men who were now away at war. Soldiers and sailors filled the streets. Despite the war's horrors in Europe, it created wealth and opportunity for many in Halifax. Much of Halifax's industrial activity was centered in the working-class neighborhood of Richmond in Halifax's North End, a tightly knit community of wooden homes, schools, and churches. Unpaved streets crisscrossed the slopes of Richmond, leading down to the harbor, where factories and naval piers, a sprawling dry dock, and railway yards bustled with activity. Further north of Richmond was the black community of Africville. Across the harbor, on the more sparsely populated Dartmouth shore, was the long-time Mi'kmaq village of Turtle Grove." End quote. So it paints a really nice picture of the city at that time. I think everybody can kind of picture this. And a lot of the memoirs you read paint a picture of, it's very much a small town sort of becoming a city. You've got booming industry happening, but also unpaved streets. And many of the gardens had chickens, for example. You know, it sounded awesome, actually. It sounded really nice. The way the harbor is shaped was also really useful, and it's interesting. So it's a natural harbor, like Boston, and as you enter, you've got your sort of standard sheltered natural harbor, and then once you're into the harbor, you can then see that there's a channel that's invisible from the open ocean. So for Halifax, it kind of worked like a secret passage in a way. So that gets really narrow. And when you go through the narrows, all ships must keep right in order to pass each other safely. And then it opens up again into Bedford Basin, which is a large enclosed bay. So it's kind of like if you had an hourglass on the table, and instead of having it at the 10 and 6, you move the top to the 12 and 6, you move the top to the 10 o'clock position, because it goes at a northeast, southwest direction. And then the bottom of the hourglass just opens up into the ocean, if that makes sense. The big enclosed basin was hugely important for forming large convoys to protect Allied ships from submarines. So they'd get all of these ships into that basin, get them into formation, and then an armed convoy would head for Europe under guard. At the start of World War I, Germany had 20 submarines in service with more in production. And one tool that was used by Allied forces to protect against submarine attacks were nets. Sorry, but I thought submarine nets were interesting, so here we go. So they were a very hastily planned deterrent. I think the US was like, oh shit, submarines. And so, because nobody really properly designed or tested these nets, and so no one had any idea if they would be useful, if they'd work or not. And they didn't work. They really, really didn't work. But since Germany didn't know that they didn't work, they mostly tried to avoid them, which meant that they did work. Do you know what I mean? Like, if Germany had had more submarines to spare, or if communications had been a little bit better, and they'd realized how ineffective they were, there maybe would have been some issues. It's like they were shit, but they worked because no one knew they were shit. So were they really shit if they worked? Kind of. But there are so many stories where, German submarines got caught in the nets and then just got out of them again. Like it wasn't that big a deal. But I think, again, because we didn't have like good wireless communication, just nobody knew. So on December 3rd, 1917, the Norwegian ship SS Emo, under the command of Håkon From, arrived from the Netherlands, before moving on to New York, where it would take on relief supplies for Belgium. The ship was in Bedford Basin for 2 days for inspection. I think every ship that arrived had neutral inspection and then would be refueled before heading down the coast to the U.S. And so the captain was in the basin. He was waiting to leave and was expected to leave on the 5th and had been cleared to do so. But her fuel load, the coal, had not arrived in time. By the time it came and it had all gotten loaded on the ship, the submarine gates were closed. And so the Emo would have to spend an extra unplanned night in the harbor, but they were not the only ones delayed and behind schedule due to these nets. Meanwhile, at the other end of the harbor, also stuck, was the French ammunition ship the SS Mont Blanc, which had arrived from New York under the command of Amy Lemedec, who was trying to get the heavily loaded supply ship safely into the basin to meet up with a large convoy. But he got stuck outside the harbor when they arrived after the net's gates had been closed. It's worth noting that before the war, this particular ship would never have been allowed into the harbor because the danger of its cargo was so great. But wartime just meant different rules, right? I mean, all kinds of things changed during wartime. Another rule, crucially, that had been broken, also because of war, is the Mont Blanc would normally be flying a red flag, signaling that she was carrying volatile cargo, but it was wartime, so obviously it's like painting a bullseye for the German submarines, right? It's like, hit this one! So let's run down a list of the cargo on the Mont Blanc, who is carrying 3 tons, basically, of explosives, as well as ammunition. It's not good. She had 62 metric tons of gun cotton. Gun cotton was a replacement for gunpowder as a propellant in firearms. It was also used to replace gunpowder as a low-order explosive in mining. So, for some reason in my head, I thought, and I'm glad I looked all this up. I was looking at I had the lists, and then I was like, I gotta look all this up to make sure I know what it means, what I think it means. That's 90% of this episode. And I, for some reason, would have thought that gun cotton was like, I don't know, I thought it was like a fuse or like a wick, like just an inert cotton material. I did not realize it was an explosive. Something like that. I didn't know it was 62 metric tons of something more powerful than gunpowder. 246 metric tons of benzol. Benzol is a coal tar product consisting mainly of benzene and toluene. They had barrels and barrels and barrels of this stuff, and once the other explosives were on board, They basically just had loads of barrels of benzol, and they just stacked them as high and as deep as they could. Every inch of the ship that had space on it, barrels of benzol. Next on the list is maybe the only one everyone will recognize, 250 tons of TNT. And then there were 2,367 tons of picric acid, which is more powerful than TNT. Wikipedia tells me that the improved safety of munitions of gun manufacturing and storage caused the replacement, or weapons manufacturing and storage, caused the replacement of picric acid for TNT for most military purposes between the world wars. So World War I, picric acid. World War II, TNT. Le Medec, aware of his dangerous cargo, ran a very tight ship, no open flame of any kind allowed on board, no matches, no smoking, no alcohol for that matter. He was just super cautious. He knew how dangerous.
That's crucial at that point. I mean, he's sitting on a literal fuck ton of explosives.
Yes, I think that is it. It's technically a metric fuck ton of explosives, I think is the correct. Yeah. So now it's the morning of December 6th, 1917. And both ships set off, eager to be on their way and make up some of that lost time. The Mont Blanc is feeling exposed, stuck outside of the nets. I should be more specific. I mentioned before that there's these nets, and there are gates in the nets, and the gates would be opened and closed each night. So they each got stuck because the gates in the nets were closed. So the Mont Blanc is desperate to get into the safety of the basin, and the Emo is just can't wait to get underway and make up lost time. So the Emo takes off speeding, empty and riding quite high in the water, making it kind of harder to steer, heading for resupply, trying to leave the harbor. Both ships take on pilots in order to navigate the Narrows, and the Mont Blanc was then surprised when they saw the Emo on their side of the Narrows, the wrong side of the Narrows. The Emo had done some maneuvering to pass another ship, but for some reason had not moved back to the correct position. The Mont Blanc signaled the Emo to move. For some reason it signaled back no. They almost stopped in time and might not have collided, but the Emo at the last moment reversed engines, which made the ship kind of lurch violently to the side because the change of direction. And it then struck and penetrated the hull of the Mont Blanc at 8:45 that morning. So when the Mont Blanc was hit, the cargo shifted, fell, that benzol is spilling on impact. And then, because the Emo was still in reverse, the two ships began to disengage, which, of course, caused sparks, and the water burst into flames, which spread very quickly.
So the benzol is a substance that is swimming on the surface of water,
It's like
right?
oil. Yes. It's like fuel. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's bad, and it's never good. It's always alarming when water is burning. It's like cute in a shot glass, but otherwise, no thank you. No thank you. So other ships witnessed this collision and see what's happening, and they see the fire has started. And so all kinds of ships are trying to approach the Mont Blanc in order to try and help to fight the fire. Because remember, nobody knows what she has on board. The crew initially tried very hard to extinguish the fire, but when they realized that there was no chance in hell this thing was going to get under control, they were like, bail, 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 bail. And so they did. They start evacuating as quickly as possible, launching lifeboats. And they are, I'm sure, thinking they're all going to, they don't have a chance. So as they're just frantically rowing to shore, the opposite shore of Halifax, Dartmouth side, it seems they may have been yelling at other ships, but there was a lot of criticism, like why didn't they do more to warn people, this kind of thing. Even if they had been yelling as loud as they could at other ships in the harbor, between the smoke, the fire, the confusion, nobody probably could have understood what they were yelling. And they were yelling in French, so would anyone have even understood them? And this is all before, walkie-talkies. They were later criticized by those who said that what they should have done was to take the ship to open ocean as soon as the fire started. And I can absolutely understand why people felt that way, but it's hard to argue with the sincere belief on behalf of the crew that they had seconds before the ship would blow. They didn't know it was going to be 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And other ships were trying to help. Many ships were trying to attach lines to do just that and tow it further out. I think, honestly, that in defense of the crew of the Mont Blanc, I think also the ship was, there's a lot of mention of how the ship was it became fully engulfed so quickly and was listless and drifting that even if they had tried to steer it to the back, turn it around and get it back out to the open ocean, I don't think there's any chance. The engine would have died. You know what I mean? They wouldn't have had any. It was just all terrible.
It's literally a series of unfortunate events there.
It is. It really is. Yeah. So at the end of the day, no one ever ended up being charged and at fault with what happened. Both ships were deemed responsible. The Emo for being on the wrong side and refusing to move, and the Mont Blanc because it should have made more of an effort to avoid being hit because they knew what they had on board. There are a lot of fascinating and easy to find documents, articles, books, podcasts that really get into the collision in depth. I've really kind of just skimmed across and given you the very basics because we just have a lot to talk about. And I want to talk more about stuff you don't find in other places as much. So we're going to move on now. On shore, the rising smoke from the now totally abandoned and drifting, burning ship grounds itself near Pier 6, and everyone in town is watching, of course. Small explosions like fireworks are going off every so often, and children and adults, just the whole area, are crowded around their windows, paused on their walk to work or school, or in their work or school looking out windows, trying to make their way closer to the waterfront to watch. People climbed on top of roofs for a better view. You know, this was an event.
I know we always make kind of a little bit fun or pulling the leg of people in medieval times and looky-loos who, went to public executions, for example. And we often say, well, what else was there to do? But I mean, let's be 100% real here and be honest. We would all be watching 100%. Or trying to see what's going on if something like this was happening. And we didn't know for sure what's the deal.
100%. Oh, yeah. There's no judgment here at all. We had a church in a neighboring town burned down months ago, and we all watched the entire thing live on the news. These things are interesting to us as people. There's no shade. Especially because so much was going on. So kids especially, I can imagine, must have found this. The way children today love to see fire trucks or emergency vehicles. It's the same thing back then,
Basically the same thing happened in Pripyat in Chernobyl, where people were from a little bit of a distance, but they were watching because they didn't know what was happening and how dangerous it actually was.
No, because how would anyone think that this was, in all the things that it could be, you just would never think this, And so everyone's watching. Ships in the harbor are making their way to the Mont Blanc, trying to turn on pumps and fight the fire. The firefighters and naval personnel are on the scene. Everyone is trying to fight this fire, but it is so hot that they really are struggling to get close enough to make any kind of difference. Meanwhile, the crew of the Mont Blanc begins to arrive on shore. One notable story is that a Mi'kmaq woman and her infant were saved when one of the sailors hit land, jumped out of the boat, started running, and he sees ahead of him this woman holding an infant, and he paused for just a split second to grab the baby and just keep on running, which is so smart because he knew this was the best way to get them both to safety. And he was right. She ran after him as fast as she could after her baby, and all three of them did actually survive. So, meanwhile, train dispatcher Vincent Coleman was at the switch that morning, controlling the come and go of trains into Richmond Station, which was quite close to the home where he lived with his wife and children. Tragically, their youngest son had died the year before, I think of diphtheria, but they still had 4 children, and he had his loving wife, Frances. Vincent was shocked when he got the call telling him that the ship was going to blow and he needed to run for it. I'm not 100% clear where this information came from, and it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, but he did run for it. And suddenly, though, he remembered that the number 10 train with 300 passengers on board was due in soon. So he ran back to the office and tapped the following message out in Morse code just over and over again along the line to the other stations. Quote, "Hold up the train, stop. An ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6 and will explode, stop. Guess this will be my last message, stop. Goodbye, boys." End quote. Moments later, at 9:04 and 0.34 seconds in the morning, on December 6, 1917, the fire on board the Mont Blanc turned that ship into a 3-kiloton bomb, and it exploded. The shockwave leveled the shores surrounding the harbor, with the Richmond neighborhood of Halifax and the Mi'kmaq community of Turtle or Tufts Grove, as it's called today, being the most severely hit. The blast was felt 130 miles away. Windows shattered 100 kilometers or 62 miles away. And we know exactly what time to the millisecond the ship exploded because of seismology records. Damn near everything within a half-mile or 800-meter radius of the blast was just gone. The force of the blast wind destroyed buildings, bent and twisted train tracks, shattered every single window where every person in town had been watching the fire, instantly killing or blinding thousands. There were so many eye injuries. Buildings were leveled. In photographs, I have so many photographs to share, and it looks like the aftermath of an F5 tornado or a major hurricane is all I compare it to. It's toothpicks. There's nothing. There's just nothing. Now I'm going to get into some really horrible but fascinating specifics. Halifax was turning into a literal hell on earth for anyone not killed immediately, and this is sincerely no exaggeration. A mushroom cloud rose high in the air, and along with it, a cloud of vaporized fuel and chemicals, which then fell like a dark, oily rain, coating everyone and everything. The ship itself was lifted about 1,000 feet or 300 meters into the air and blown apart, becoming shrapnel itself. A large part of her anchor landed 2 miles away. I wanted to understand more about the medical science of a blast wave, and I wanted to understand what exactly happens when you hear someone was killed instantly. Like, what does that mean exactly? And I also wanted to prepare you a little bit for the kinds of things that you're going to hear in witness accounts, and that's going to be next week. And I just wanted to really understand what the victims and the first responders were dealing with. So I found an article on the website for the National Center for Biotechnology Information. They had a really good journal article about blast injuries, and it was written by, and apologies if I mispronounce these names, Michael R. Jorolemon, Richard A. Lopez, Diane M. Kryko, Krywko. I apologize for not knowing the pronunciation on that. But those are the authors of this journal article. And I learned so much about explosions reading this. And so let's just run through this. I've kind of re-edited all of this. I've edited all of it into terms that make a little bit more sense. But this is where they are the source for all of this information. And anything I get wrong was my mistake. So we're speaking specifically about high-order explosives. And they write, quote, "High-order explosives have a strong supersonic pressure wave known as the blast wave or shock wave. In addition to the blast wave, blast wind is the flow of superheated air that can cause injury or damage. Immediate death can occur from an explosion as a result of extensive pulmonary injury with pulmonary hemorrhage causing suffocation." So that means your lungs would flood with blood and you would drown in your own blood. a pulmonary embolism, severe head injury, significant internal injuries, amputation, or impalement on an object. Injuries occur in 4 categories. Primary, which is the blast wave, secondary, which is debris, tertiary, which is you crashing into something or something else crashing into or onto you, and quaternary, which is like elements, i.e., in this case, you're trapped in rubble and now the rubble is on fire and also it's snowing. We're going to get to that. Unique to high-order explosions, primary blast injuries are caused when the blast wave moves through your body. The blast wave causes worse damage to air-filled organs and affects them as follows. So, your eyes. Eyeballs can rupture or be forced out of their sockets. Blast eye injuries include pain, swelling, bruising around the orbit, bleeding from the eyes, decreased vision or blindness. This does not include people who were blinded by glass or other debris entering their eyes. That would be a secondary injury. Then we've got the ears. You might have perforated eardrum, middle ear damage, should be considered in any victim that has decreased hearing, tinnitus, vertigo, and/or bleeding from the ears. And if there is bleeding from the ear, the blast was probably intense enough to cause injury to the lungs and other hollow organs. In instances where the ear is overpressurized, the tiny bones of the ear can be dislocated, fractured, and permanently destroyed. On to the lungs. Injury to lung tissue, which, this is a terrifying fact, can have delayed symptom presentation. If the pressure exceeds 40 psi, the victim could sustain bruised or collapsed lungs, air embolisms, lung scarring, and subcutaneous emphysema. Subcutaneous emphysema is when you have a bunch of fluid under the skin that basically shouldn't be there. Pulmonary contusion is the most common respiratory system injury and can be delayed in presentation up to 48 hours. So like 2 days later, all of a sudden you have bruised lungs. Ugh. Next we have blast belly. This is injuries causing abdominal hemorrhage and perforation, which can be, again, immediate or delayed. It can also cause injury to solid organs and, everybody's favorite, testicular rupture. Blast belly should be considered in any victim presenting with abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting blood, rectal or testicular pain, abdominal distension, and/or rigidity. The colon is the most common area to hemorrhage and perforate. And as with the lungs, it can happen immediately or could be delayed up to 48 hours. Solid organ damage happens much less than hollow organ damage, which makes sense, right? Because it's the air. It's moving the air in your body in waves that are fucking you up. And then last but not least, we've got blast brain. So blast brain is injury to the brain even without direct injury to the head. So we are speaking very specifically of how the shock wave will affect and injure the brain in your skull without anything else happening. No hitting your head, no nothing. So blast brain should be considered in any victim that presents with headache, fatigue, confusion, poor concentration, amnesia, and decreased levels of consciousness. Let's see, the article ends by saying the heart can also be damaged by the blast wave. Victims can have chest pain, tachycardia, decreased pulse pressure, cardiac dysrhythmia, and/or low blood pressure as a result of heart involvement. And in victims with multiple presenting injuries or incidents with multiple casualties, injuries can be very easy to miss. Victims of primary injuries may not initially show any obvious signs of injury.
It's like with car accidents, just like magnitude more horrible.
Yes.
You know, when they say, even if you feel fine and you don't think you're injured, you should go to the hospital always to be checked out.
Yes, and Natasha, Liam Neeson's wife, you know, she had that skiing accident. I mean, totally different thing, but had that skiing accident, thought she was fine, and then, you know. So that article was really helpful because when you read the witness accounts, there are an alarming number of references to bodies with no heads being hard to identify. And I just had to know why. It's kind of like the same reason I feel compelled to look at crime scene photos in a way. Like, I don't really want to know, but I need to know. Like, I need to know specifically what happened to these people so that I can kind of, I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we want to know. I think we want to understand.
So now we're going on to the secondary blast injuries. These are the majority of injuries. This is debris injuries. This is the scary fact in debris injuries, which are the most common cause of death to victims of an explosion. They can be very deceiving. The force of the explosion can propel debris many times faster than a bullet. So what looks like a tiny wound could be hiding an actually devastating injury, right? You could have the tiniest, looking injury, hardly even bleeding, and you could have moments, Injuries can include fractures, amputations, lacerations, dislocations, and any kind of soft tissue injury. Next, we have tertiary blast injuries. Those are caused either by a person being lifted up and thrown through the air by the blast wind and impacting with something, or when a structure collapse because of the blast wind causes injury, or because of the shockwave causes injury. The resulting injury can be blunt trauma due to impact, or penetrating injury if you are impaled on something or if something enters the body. High explosive blasts can also cause skull fractures, fractured bones, head injuries, open and closed fractures, amputations, you name it. I mean, there's almost nothing that's not included. And the other thing is structural collapse and entrapment can cause a lot of crushing injuries and also compartment syndrome. So the longer it takes to get someone out of the rubble, obviously, the higher their chance of not making it. And finally, we have quaternary blast injuries, which I think of as the aftermath injuries. These are the ones caused by exposure to the resulting fire, fumes, radiation, biological agents, just everything else that you're being exposed to because of what was in that disgusting rain on everybody, and awful. Also included in the psychological impact of the event, but probably not at this time, is things like PTSD, the trauma that can happen. Yeah. So that is a really terrible list of what happens to your body just from an explosion. And we're going to get into more specifics soon. But isn't it awful?
Yeah, and most of the time it will be a combination of several of those types of injuries, not just clean-cut one or the other. And I think it's interesting to have it all laid out like this. I think most people, including me, always just think of the immediate injuries from such an event, but we tend to forget that there is so much more. And I don't want to sound blasé, but I think you're very lucky if the blast kills you instantly.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. Totally agree. I'm very glad that you also found it interesting and it wasn't just me, because I was like, but how? I think in my mind, when I hear someone gets killed instantly in an explosion, especially, I almost imagine that they're vaporized. In my mind. Do you know what I mean? When I hear there was an explosion and people were killed instantly, I don't know. This was just interesting to sort of take. All right. So now we have to get on to everything else that's happening to these people. And keep in mind how quickly all of this would have happened, right? The explosion happens and you have your shockwave. And then it was so hot, it vaporized all of the water. And there were survivors who recalled seeing the ocean floor of the harbor, which, how terrifying would that be, honestly, right? Before the Atlantic came rushing in to fill that space, creating a 18-meter or 60-foot high tsunami, which then crashed over the shores, washing away the dead, the injured. It dragged women, men, children out to sea. Many people would never be seen again. There were so many bodies in the harbor. The Emo, the ship, was tossed to the far shore where it was beached. And that was the tsunami. Smaller ships like the whaling ships and other smaller ships in the harbor were literally thrown, during the explosion, just cartwheeling across the devastation and death was terrific. Yeah. And then the people in homes and other buildings that were high enough and far enough away to have avoided the worst of that initial blast and tsunami realized that there were fires all over the city because cooking stoves, coal furnaces, fireplaces, and oil lamps had started fires all over the place during the explosion. Not to mention the debris that was falling down on the area along with that disgusting, oily rain. All of a sudden, it's a race against time. I read something or heard something somewhere where somebody was saying how their neighbor's house had come down and the father was trying to dig his child out of the rubble and kept pausing because every time he'd move a piece of debris, the child would start crying really hard. And the neighbor came running in and was like, "We don't have time for this. Your house is on fire. You got to get her out before she burns to death." And this was happening everywhere. And to make things worse, the fire chief, Edward Condon, had been killed immediately as he was right next to the ship trying to assist, as were many of the firefighters, as well as the city's only fire pumping truck were all destroyed during the explosion.
This sounds like, if you imagine hell on earth, this is what it sounds like. It's literal hell.
Literally, right? The shockwave, the tsunami, the fire. We haven't even gotten to the snow yet. It's like the circles. Yeah. So when the explosion happened, it cut Nova Scotia off from the rest of the world. Roads were destroyed, telegraph and telephone lines, submarine cables were all destroyed by the blast. So it was a real problem for the war effort, although they did get things repaired in record time. But Vince being able to send those messages was a huge help. Vince Coleman obviously did not survive the blast, but the fact that he went back, he would not have survived regardless. You know, even if he had run for it, he probably would not have made it. But he didn't know that. So the fact that he went back to send those messages was a huge help because otherwise it would have taken an incredibly long time for people to realize what had happened because they couldn't contact anybody. So when the explosion happened, Vince and Frances Coleman's daughter Eleanor was in school, and her daughter Anne recounted the experience to Amy Smith of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, and she says, quote, "They heard this tremendous bang and they saw clouds coming up from the harbor. And the teacher said, 'I think, children, we are being attacked. Run home.' So they all ran home," she said.
Okay, so she used the term attack. I'm assuming that they didn't know what was happening, that they thought, well, it was wartime, they thought the enemy is attacking them.
Exactly
the
right.
Germans.
Yep. The enemy.
Yeah, the enemy.
Yeah, that's exactly what they thought. They thought that they were, which makes more sense. That would be a more...
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly what many people thought had happened, that they had been attacked by the Germans. And so Anne continues, quote, "My mother said the street was on fire, houses were burning, and people were running up the Russell Street hill. They were all running, screaming, and yelling." End quote. She tells the CBC that the house collapsed, leaving her grandmother Frances and her Aunt Eileen, who was the baby in the family, with very, very serious injuries that would take months to heal. Because of this, the children went to live with their grandmother and then with other family members, which was incredibly difficult for everyone. You know, they've just lost their husband and father, and now they're all kind of being split up and moved around. But after a year and a half, Frances recovered enough to get the family reunited, and she would raise her 4 children as a widow and didn't really have very much to remember him by. In that same article, her granddaughter says, quote, "She had my grandfather's telegrapher's key and his watch. They were the only 2 things that were given to her when they found the body. They were kept in a very safe place. They were very treasured by my grandmother." Smith writes, quote, "Coleman's final telegraph message, 'Munitions ship on fire, making for Pier 6, goodbye,' is now etched in history. However, historians don't know if Coleman's frantic pleas stopped the train." Quote, "The train was held up at Rockingham Station but was running late to begin with," said Richard McMichael, coordinator of interpretive programming at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. The museum holds many artifacts from the explosion. "The most important thing to know is even if he didn't stop the train, the messages that he sent out went as far as Truro, and it gave people there a sense that something was wrong in Halifax. He's still a hero." End quote. So the number 10 train that he was warning had received only minor damage, but of course it couldn't get into Richmond because there was so much damage and debris on the tracks. And as they were arriving and the passengers were horrified by this devastation, they quickly mobilized. They searched the train, they grabbed all the tools they could find on board, and got off the train to rescue survivors from wrecked homes. They tore up sheets from the train and used them to bandage the wounded. Children were used to send messages all over the place. The children became like messengers. And the train very quickly became a hospital train that would then turn back and take those injured north to Truro. Because of Vince Coleman's message, help from surrounding areas was being mobilized and would arrive within hours. And that, again, crucial. If they hadn't suffered enough, a blizzard was on the way and would arrive the morning after the explosion. And more trains could not arrive for another 2 days. But at least it was on the way. And I have a letter here from the governor of Massachusetts, Samuel McCall. It's dated 6th of December, which is the day of the explosion. And this is to the mayor of Halifax, Peter Martin, who was actually out of town when this happened, but I'm not sure anybody here knew that. And so this is the letter that he has written to Peter Martin. Quote, "My dear Mr. Mayor, I am sending the Honorable A.C. Racheski of the Massachusetts Public Safety Committee immediately to your city with the corps of our best state surgeons and nurses, in the belief that they may be of service to you in this hour of need. I need hardly say to you that we have the strongest affection for the people of your city, and that we are anxious to do everything possible for their assistance at this time. Kindly express to the people of your city the very deep sympathy of the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and assure them that we are ready to answer any call that they may need to make upon us. Immediately upon hearing the terrible blow dealt to Halifax, I sent the following telegram to you. Quote, understand your city is in danger from explosion and conflagration. Reports only fragmentary. Massachusetts stands ready to go to the limit in rendering every assistance you may need of. Wire me immediately." End quote. Upon being informed that the wires were out of commission through the good offices of the federal government at Washington, this further telegram was sent to you by wireless. Quote, since sending my telegram this morning offering unlimited assistance, an important meeting of citizens has been held, and Massachusetts stands ready to offer aid in any way you can avail yourself of it. We are prepared to send forward immediately a special train with surgeons and other medical assistants, but await advice from you. End quote. Won't you please call upon Mr. Racheski for every help you need? The Commonwealth will stand at his back. Respectfully yours, Samuel McCall. P.S. This is the best. P.S. Realizing that time is of the utmost importance, we have not waited for your answer, but have dispatched the train. I thought that was so interesting because it's like, hey, I don't know if you heard, but I did send you a message, all right? And then it's like, hi, I heard you might not have gotten my first message. Did you get this one? And then it's like, you know what? Let's just go ahead and send the surgeons. Let's just send them. And so they did. And so I was curious who Racheski was because I figured he must be kind of important if he was sent with the train. And he's fascinating. So this is what I found on his charitable foundation's website. A.C. Cap, which is what he went by, Racheski, Abraham C. Racheski, was born in Boston in 1866, the son of Jewish immigrants. In 1895, at the age of 30, Cap, as he was called, and his brother Israel, founded the United States Trust Company. This Jewish bank, the first in Boston, responded to the needs of the rising immigrant population by providing access to capital and banking services not otherwise available to these individuals. Cap was a social activist and understood the power of political persuasion. He was a member of the Massachusetts Republican State Committee, a delegate to the Republican National Convention in 1904, and a representative in the Massachusetts State Legislature. From 1930 to 1932, Cap served as United States Minister to Czechoslovakia. Cap was a philanthropist. He was among the founders of Beth Israel Hospital. That's my hospital. Moving on. In December 1917, Cap helped organize and finance the medical relief team which was dispatched to Nova Scotia in response to the Halifax disaster. In appreciation, the city of Halifax presented a large evergreen tree to the city of Boston the following November. Yeah, so end quote. There's more, but he's just a really interesting person. He also helped to save Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution, the oldest still commissioned naval ship in America. He was a really impressive, interesting man. It's just, we talk so often about the worst people, right? Like, generally when we write an episode, we are telling you about the worst of the worst of the worst. So when I find people like these people that I'm telling you about today, it's just nice. It's just nice to share. Just a reminder, not everyone's terrible. The explosion happened at 9 a.m., and by 11 a.m., Boston had started to mobilize. According to the Massachusetts Historical Society, Governor McCall immediately called a meeting of the State Committee of Public Safety. They say that in some respects, Massachusetts was well prepared for an emergency. The United States had been at war since April 1917, and there had been broad local support for military and civilian preparedness even before the declaration of war. On the other hand, state National Guard units and many staff members from Boston area hospitals, the state's best-trained emergency personnel, were on their way to or had already arrived in France. Nevertheless, by 10 p.m. on the 6th of December, that same evening, the first relief train loaded with medical personnel and supplies left Boston for Halifax. And I think that is a good place to stop for now, because next week we're going to talk about that train journey and then the absolute horrors awaiting rescue. Don't eat next week during next week's episode. It's bad.
I can't wait. I find the whole story so fascinating, sad, devastating, but so interesting. I knew, as I told you in the beginning, almost nothing about it. And so that's all brand new information.
I'm so glad that this is interesting to you, because I have been pulling out hair, picking and choosing which stories to tell. Something good. Do you have anything good?
My something good is that currently my husband is home. It's been 5.5 months since he's been home the last time. So it's been a while, and it's really just, it's something good. It's so good.
It is good. Very good. Mine is it's Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. My dad and my sister are here, and Paul's dad, and we're going to go to some of our best friends for Thanksgiving this year, just down the road. So, yeah, hopefully have a nice, quiet day. The other something good that I want to tell everybody about is the tree lighting. So you know that we get this annual tree every year from Halifax as a thank you for our response, and we're going to talk more about that next week. But the actual tree lighting is the day before part 2 drops. It's the same night as our Patreon get-together on Thursday, November 30th. So let me tell you about that just for local people. The local people. The City of Boston website says, quote, "The City of Boston and guests from the province of Nova Scotia will celebrate the 82nd annual tree lighting on Boston Common on Thursday, November 30th. Mayor Michelle Wu, the Boston Parks and Rec Department, and the title sponsor, the province of Nova Scotia, will host Boston's signature holiday celebration, the 82nd annual Boston Christmas tree lighting, from 6 to 8 p.m., in Boston Common. Mayor Wu will be joined by Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston, marking the 52nd year that Nova Scotia has given a tree to the people of Boston as thanks for relief efforts following the explosion of a munition ship in Halifax Harbor."
Why are there years missing?
Well, they gave one, we'll talk about it more next week, but they gave one the first winter after. In 1918, they gave one, and then in the early 70s, they kicked it up again. They decided to start doing it, and they made it an annual. And so, let's see. I just saw the entertainment. Okay, so there's going to be a live broadcast on Channel 5, if anybody is local. And then this year's entertainment includes PJ Morton from Maroon 5. There will be cast members performing numbers from Moulin Rouge, the musical. There will be the Flutie Foundation Spectrum of Sound Choir. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of entertainment. There's going to be, choirs and music from both Nova Scotia and the US, Broadway numbers, gospel numbers. It's going to be great. So if you're interested, go check it out. This year, and we're going to talk more about this next week because the way they get the tree is fascinating. I always thought that the tree was like from a Christmas tree farm, but it's not. It's a whole thing. There's a committee. Most of the trees that they send us come from people's yards. So this year's is a 45-foot tall white spruce donated by Betty Corley and her family. And so, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week. But they basically have a committee that knows where all the good trees are, and they just kind of watch them. And then most of them, some cases they said it'll be like, oh, yeah, my great-grandfather planted that tree. But if it's going to Boston, then fine. It's like they're really proud. It's a very proud thing.
Yeah, I get it. It's like an honor.
It is an honor. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's the showpiece. And then after the tree lighting, there's going to be fireworks. So go check it out if you like to get out and about during the season and kind of get into the spirit. There you go. All right. Okay. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, we would be so, so grateful if you would leave us a rating and a review. If you didn't like this episode, try a different one. We got a lot of different topics. And if we're not the right show for you, that's okay too. We're free. Yeah. And there's lots of free entertainment out there for everyone. We just appreciate it. That's all. Yeah, that's all I want to say.
Very much. Very much. If you want to know more about ways how to contact us, how to buy merch, how to support us, go to our webpage, freshhellpodcast.com. There you find all the links. Our email address is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. Send us your listener stories. Send us your experiences with the creepy and macabre sides of life. And I think that's it. Please tell your pets we said hi. Hug them, cuddle them, take them to the vet, give them treats, check them for ticks. I don't know what you do with all the other... I just have experience with dogs. I don't know how to take care of an iguana or of a bird or of a snake.
Sprinkle his vitamin powder on his crickets. Make sure that his cage is the right temperature and humidity.
Yeah. Be also kind to other humans out there if it's safe. And be kind to yourself. And that's the hardest part of it all.
That's right. And just remember, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Every single year.
Every year. I gotta do it. I gotta do it.